Welcome to our interview series on Technology Impact Assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute and a visiting scientist at Arizona State University. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability, and is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as our Indian counterparts. It's been ongoing since November 2024 and will be coming to a close by this November 2025. In this series, we are focusing on technology impact assessment for peace and stability, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gatra Priyandita, who is a senior analyst with ASPI's Cyber Technology and Security Program, ASPI being the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. His primary research area is in cyber diplomacy and the military applications of emerging technology, and he also provides commentary on foreign and defense policy issues in Southeast Asia. Welcome, Dr. Gatra.
Thanks so much, Katina, for having me.
As I didn't cover your disciplinary background, I have it here in front of me, but I'd want you to say it in your own words. Where did you start out in this area? What discipline are you in?
So I'm actually a political scientist by training, and I did my PhD looking at the intersections of comparative politics and international relations in Southeast Asia, with a focus on Indonesia-China relations. I got into the world of cyber and tech really quite late in my research career. It was really an interest in the intersections of emerging technology and international security. So I was interested in things like 5G security, for example, and when I joined ASPI, my work really became all about cyber diplomacy and capacity building, a bit of tech diplomacy as well, and still interested in things like national security implications of certain technologies, particularly as it relates to Southeast Asia.
It's interesting, Dr. Gatra. We've had people from law, we've had people from public policy, many diverse areas and backgrounds. People generally don't think political scientists have that edge with technology. However, and I say that because I've met many of them in my lifetime, what do political scientists bring to the table that is a unique skill set for things like technology impact assessment?
Well, I think the political scientists at the end of the day look at institutions, right? And we look at how ideas shape policy and how ideas shape regulations. And when we think about technology impact assessments, at the end of the day, they're about how you think about how technologies impact society, how they impact national security. So my background, I guess, my disciplinary background helps inform me or gives me this perspective about how past policies, past ideas shape the way that technology is seen. And when we think about Southeast Asia and how technology is seen in the region, there are competing ideas and beliefs about how technology should be regulated. There are those who are advocates of sovereignty and security who think, especially foreign technology, we must be super careful. We must make sure that they are super regulated. We must make sure that there's every possibility of ensuring that elements of that technology not only benefit society, but also benefits the business community, and that technologies get transferred to the business community as well. But then there are those out there who are saying, we don't have an indigenous capabilities ourselves. So I think it's important for us to be able to engage with the tech community overseas. And that means sometimes having looser impact assessments or looser regulations, looser requirements for the export and import of technologies. So it's very important to understand the sources of, for us to understand why countries adopt different types of measures when it comes to technology impact assessments or risk assessments. It's important to understand how these ideas originate, because it's all about politics at the end of the day.
Yes. So many well-known designers always say technology is heavily political as an instrument. Tell us how technology impact assessment relates to your work today or in the past.
Right. So I work on a few things at ASPI, and one of the things that we look at, again, is the national security implications of certain emerging technologies. This can come in the form of artificial intelligence or 5G and so on, digital infrastructure as well. So when we, as part of our work, we do provide advice and analysis and research on things like how countries identify their preferred vendors and equipments. And this means going into, again, what they consider high risk, what they consider, what's important to think about when they procure equipment. It could be, again, the educational implications that come out of it. So again, we might choose this vendor because they provide soft services in the form of capacity building or education. So there's a social element. And there's variation, again, in how countries adopt this. I think generally, if you're a developing country, you want to ensure that the technology that comes in can benefit society and community. I think this incentive to find the community/social benefits of technology is much higher. But at the same time, I think the pushbacks can be a lot harder as well, especially those who seek to benefit from some kinds of technologies, right? They just want to see, for example, a less regulated technology system.
I think that's been fascinating from the interviews we've conducted thus far, particularly the distinction in the global south to the global north. And if I can say, in so many parts in Southeast Asia, where the benefit is so important, we adopt because we need it,
Yeah.
and we need to see it actually have societal value. Um, how do you think we close the gap in intent of TIAs, or do you think it's permeable depending on the context of uh, different nation states?
I think the great challenge with a lot of TIAs is that they often come with as additions to some kind of capacity building support or some kind of social support. Oftentimes from a donor country. If we're thinking about TIAs in developing countries, as a practice or as an initiative, they cost a lot. They can cost a lot of money. Even if they don't cost a lot of money, sometimes it's not things that governments would necessarily prioritize, right? Thinking about, for example, not just necessarily technologies that concern national security, but thinking about the implications of certain tech, for example, that may have in the health sector or the environment sector. Sometimes it is those donor countries that are pushing developing countries to think about the effects on, say, water ecosystem or something. So right now, we're still quite dependent on that model where a lot of advanced economies expect developing countries to do those measurements. But sometimes that money, again, is not consistent, right? There has to be an internal movement itself within developing countries to adopt TIAs that assess the social implications of technologies. Again, it becomes a funding issue.
Mm,
So it's challenging in that front because then the gap will just continue to stay a gap.
yes, very much so. Um, do you think there are other ways to describe TIAs or technology assessments as related to the examples you provided? Do they go by any other name?
Um, I'm not entirely sure. I think they will probably, impact assessments as a whole will probably you can attach those two terms to anything, and then and that may be how it works out in many different initiatives and arrangements. I think a core feature, of course, is just putting in foresight into any kinds of activity or initiative, right? I think it's always a very attractive idea to add in technology to any new technologies to any kind of measure or initiative, but then when one doesn't think about the social implications, that gets problematic. Increasingly, I think in some countries there is that domestic movement to think about the social repercussions. I mean, I do a lot of work on Indonesia, for example, and one of the main cyber-related issues now associated with tech, social issues associated with tech, come in the form of things like cyberbullying and getting people, say, for example, obsessed with technology like artificial intelligence. There's a lot of discussion right now on how can we make sure that, while yes, at the same time we want to have incorporated artificial intelligence into all lines of work, we don't necessarily impact the workforce, right, or other kinds of environments and ecosystems. But I think, yeah, it's all about foresight. But at the moment, again, the challenge just goes back to funding.
Definitely. I've been thinking about how much of what we call TIAs today are really socio-technical impact assessments, not just technology impact assessments. We're often told just don't study the technology, in an isolated fashion. Because, as you mentioned previously, it has a political element to it, sociocultural element, environmental element, and so much more. And it's interesting to hear about your work in Indonesia, giving it such a fast-moving market, particularly in the mobile space,
Yeah.
and so much of the existing history, existing social cultural context butts up against so much of the modern development. I don't mean in terms of adoption of technology, but perhaps some of the things that could infiltrate the country in terms of media and otherwise, that may not have been historically acceptable. All of those outside first forces that we're constantly, challenged by as everyday parents, of course, in the global north, but also now looking at opportunities. But with that fast-moving pace, I think Indonesia, correct me if I'm wrong, is the fourth fastest growing mobile market in the world, smartphone market. But you'll be able to tell us more. But how do you keep pace with this change? And it seems that from what you're saying, technology impact assessments could be an instrument to support the capability, but also its social implications.
You're probably right. I mean, Indonesia always occupies a top five position when it comes to technology adoption, especially when it relates to things like social media and mobile phone use. There are a lot of mobile phones now just beyond the traditional Apple and Samsungs and Huawei's that we hear about, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. And now a lot of young people are getting access to it, including a lot of children. Indonesia has actually been quite inspired by Australia's attempt to ban social media use for kids under 16. And that's become one of the pet projects of the president, actually. Again, showing just how the social aspects of technology matter a great deal, I think, to the presidency. And that matters a great deal as well in terms of prioritizing, because, as I said, TIAs are oftentimes underfunded. But when there is that political backing, and of course, that becomes a completely different situation. Generally, I think governments are very slow to regulate or follow up with technological advancements. Um, you know, it's challenging to think of. It's challenging to think about following the social repercussions of technologies, let alone the technical, environmental, and so on. Right? It's always a matter of catching up. What does happen, at least in the Indonesian case, is that there is an active discussion, oftentimes with stakeholders. There is now across Southeast Asia an effort to create an AI safety network, for example, just on the subject of artificial intelligence. Because as you and I know, I mean, the risks come in multiple forms, right? And it's important to have somebody monitoring these kinds of these risks and raising the alarm should there be a problem. Now, capacity building and information sharing between states matter a great deal. I think there's a lot of value in sharing information about the technology, about the impact of certain technologies, both social and technical, because at the end of the day, again, it's not going to be necessarily a priority for certain states or others because of funding. So that's been, I think, how a lot of countries benefit in the form of capacity building. I mean, these kinds of TIA workshops that of course Australia and India are doing is just an example of how support can come in, right? It's just sharing impact assessment, sharing views on the challenges. Resourcing, again, a problem, but information sharing is oftentimes the way to overcome that.
Yeah, we've been amazed by the overwhelming support from people across the region, and beyond those sort of, soft borders that we're talking about. But yes, it hasn't just been Australia and India. To our amazement, people from Africa, you know, everywhere, Southeast Asia are logging on to listen and to learn more about this as it affects everybody. Um, so much to say about Indonesia. I think they are moving quickly in some very positive ways. You mentioned the president's support of all of these social implications. I know I was working on a digital design standard for children through the IEEE, and that standard was actually adopted as an underlying element of the ICT law last year, from memory, September. It came into action in Indonesia, and now working towards regulation and then enforcement, but really encouraging local suppliers to abide by those principles and now the Act, because a lot of innovation is happening within the borders. But
Mm.
this is interesting when you refer specifically that it is like a capacity building tool to raise awareness about technologies. And I think as a function that's very underplayed. Not many
Yeah,
people have mentioned that so far, but
yeah.
I think you're right. It is a capacity building tool.
Yes. You're referring to, I think, the data protection bill, which came into effect recently, although still a lot of problems with implementation.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, going back to your point, you're right. Oftentimes, capacity building can just come in a simple form of just information sharing. It doesn't have to be in the form of necessarily providing anything beyond that. I mean,
Mm,
I think some governments would be excited and elated if you can come in with more than that. But capacity building is a relatively cheap form of supporting each other, right? Information sharing and so on. And a lot of the questions I tend to get in Indonesia when we talk about technology and laws is again, how does Australia do it, right? How would India do it? Uh, and just providing these frameworks about how Australia does things could be super useful. There are a lot of bureaucrats right now constantly thinking about ways in which they can minimize the negative impacts of technology on the social domain, on the economic domain, and so on. But then the challenge again is oftentimes political and about resources and priorities. It may
yes.
not be a priority, right? I mean, right now, a major priority is on the law on social media use for kids. So this has sort of amplified, I think, this as an issue. But I mean, cyber and tech capacity building, um, things that countries like Australia and India can work together on, right? And I think there's a lot of appetite for that. We've organized a lot of workshops in Southeast Asia, not just in Indonesia, looking at cyber and tech. And take-up is always relatively decent. You're not going to see immediate changes, but then of course that goes back to the politics and the money. But the thing is, like, sometimes it just takes inspiring one person or informing the right person at the right time for them to enact change.
Yes, we hear it's a long-term endeavor, and you're right. It's conversation at a time, person to person at a time, and workshops, as you're saying, to keep that awareness and continuum. Um, if I was to ask you and put you on the spot, what is TIA as a basic definition?
I think so. TIA is sort of like a process to evaluate the social, economic, technical implications of certain technologies, right? I mean, we've already talked about it in a way.
Yes.
It's easy to just introduce any technology, but then there has to be a process to figure out what does this new technology mean in the long run. It could come in the form of just certain new again. Let's look at the work that I do. Say a certain equipment for telecommunications. Um, Sure, it may improve, it may be useful, it may do what it's needed to do, what it needs to do. But then that same technology might be emitting a lot of carbon, or it might be doing A, B, and C. It might be posing cybersecurity risks.
And
Yeah.
the elements that you like to see when we talk about a technology impact assessment, what are those things that you scan for, you look for? Is there something prescribed or it's more fluid than that?
I do think it's better to see something a bit more fluid. Don't come in with that. Of course, we're always going to come in with certain assumptions, but then I think TIAs are best done multidisciplinarily. Getting as much input as possible because sometimes you just don't know what the impact of certain things are, of technologies are for other elements, right? Personally, again, I think a core driver of TIA should be foresight. How can we make sure that this technology, as it upgrades and continue to upgrades, um, doesn't produce the kinds of risk that it does. And that's a never-ending conversation. I mean, it's you're never going to have something be perfect.
In terms of methods of data collection, so we've mentioned foresight planning, perhaps.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of methods that you've seen employed in evidence gathering towards the construction of a TIA?
I think for the most part, it's decent to create some degree of metrics, but it comes down to, I think, interviews. And I haven't really participated in, say, TIA when it comes to environment or health, so I can't really speak on that. But on say national security, we look at vulnerabilities and evidence where risks produced by certain technologies are repeated, or they act. If we know that certain technologies create vulnerabilities, the people that introduce those equipments, those entities, repeat the same thing over and over again. Because oftentimes when you think about technology procurement or equipment procurement, there's a legacy component there. People buy certain equipments because there's a degree of comfort, right? A, or B, there are vested interests. Um, but when there's evidence, for example, that certain technologies create more vulnerabilities, then it's probably a good thing to think around that, right? I mean, future procurements, for example, can try to figure out different equipments. So I guess that's where we come in.
Yes, I worked for a telecommunications vendor, one of the biggest in the world, before I started out in academia. And we had this thing called a plan of records. It's the kind of functionality you'll introduce over time based on customer feedback and other information. But do you think on this train of thought, a TIA could be used to identify risks that are tolerable and those that are not and need to be treated? Could we create a TIA that is a form of a risk register, perhaps, or that's going beyond the scope of a TIA?
I think overall it's possible. I mean, you'll end up exploring how the effect. Again, if you try to adopt a fairly multidisciplinary approach to TIA, you will end up with a list anyway. And it takes a bit of analysis, I think, to probably come up with that registry and make sure that that registry isn't applied, generally, because I think there are obviously going to be unique circumstances to each technology. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely feasible.
Fascinating. Um, do you think that the outcomes of a TIA are well understood by their sponsor organization or agency? Do you think they're useful beyond recommendations? How are they adopted?
When they're adopted when there's bureaucratic and political will, I think. Again, with certain technologies, procurements oftentimes are dependent on legacy and vendor interest of many different factors, right? Sometimes it could just be simple costs. In which case, even if you can come up with evidence that it's not amazing in the long run because of other political pressures, other priorities, then it just gets shelved. Um, the TIA work that I've done in Southeast Asia oftentimes gets stalled because of this. So they don't really see much progress beyond, say, maybe, and I don't work on the technical elements, so that would be somebody else normally. Um, but I work on the strategic elements, right?
Hmm.
Um, Maybe there might be some slight adjustments, but then if recommendations on a strategic level were not accepted because they would be too costly or something, when I say costly, I mean both, again, it's finance and political, then they'll just get shelved.
Yeah, we've seen the same. We totally agree. Um, Can we move towards a little bit your area of expertise that comes down to, I guess, the cyber diplomacy, looking as well at security programs, military applications, and cyber diplomacy in general, uh, and the instrument of TIA. How can it be used for peace and stability?
Um, I mean, that's a good question. I think technologies of many kinds, can have fairly disruptive effects, right? Um, Launching a cyber attack, for example, will have elements where bits of it get spread out to computer systems beyond just the target, and this can have social repercussions. It could affect the hospital that serves computer system with a nuclear power plant, for example. I think identifying sort of making things more precise is sort of the best way in which TIA can be most used for peace and stability. Beyond that, again, communication technology in particular are oftentimes quite vulnerable because of the risk of, say, backdoor implementation and so on. This creates vulnerabilities in the country's overall communication systems, right? For security, and to be for peace and stability as well, it's important to be able to identify what the risks of certain technologies are for that, and TIs can be helpful on that front.
We have now increasing dialogue about 5G and the connectedness of the potential 6G coming on. I know that's a little bit in the distance, but um, what are some of the existing technology impact assessment issues around 5G and 6G when we have all of this connectivity, machine to people, etc.? What should we be thinking about as TIA uh, uh, auxiliary or experts in that space?
I think going beyond just social and economic matters and thinking about geopolitical dimensions are becoming more and more important, right? There's obviously deepening strategic competition, and that's most evident in the economic and technological space. Procurements of certain equipments and technologies end up blocking off access to certain other kinds of equipments. And it becomes more necessary to think about things like dependence, and including supply chain dependence. Uh, this is not necessarily a TIA matter. I think it's much broader than that. But it becomes necessary whenever you think about the impact of certain technologies that you think about the geopolitical repercussions and strategic repercussions as well. And again, this is going to be more challenging in countries that are more focused on where I think the development imperative is actually driving a lot of conversation, I think, on tech, because you think about costs, and that's completely normal, I think, especially if you're pushing for digital transformation, right? So the security conversation is always going to be a bit uncomfortable, but I think it's something that's increasingly important to have, because dependence or even procurement of certain technologies can have security implications in the long run, and they may be more costly later on than now. So
Yes,
broader
and
than TIA.
certainly. And I know, given the products we used to sell within the company I work for, really you don't get more specific in terms of access to personal information,
Yeah,
uh, billing requirements, and so
yeah.
forth. And I won't go into further details, but yes, the AAA beginning with authorization is a big thing
Mhm.
in most of these large network systems. Um, do you think we talked about 5G and 6G? Do you think that we should be identifying critical emerging technologies on lists as they emerge? Do you think we can do that with allies in the region, whether we're talking about Australia and India or Australia and Indonesia? Do you think we should be corroborating around sharing what we believe are critical emerging technologies, and should we be publishing lists on this, as Australia has done, for example?
I think it's super helpful, definitely, to inform your partners about the kinds of technology that you find to be most important, and at the bare minimum, that allows the other side to also know, well, your partners to also know what areas there can be collaboration on, right? There's a growing effort towards things like friendshoring as a means of preventing economic coercion or coercion of any kind, and this creates opportunities, I think, for partners, including, say, Australia and India. This is where I think the use comes in. I think more broadly, um, communicating what you identify as the most important critical technologies for both economic and national security purposes is useful for just as a government communication thing, right? It informs the public of what you've identified to be important and maybe vulnerable. And ideally, again, this would inform businesses, for example, to take into consideration collaboration with companies that may be selling certain equipments or materials that may be in places that are less friendly. Um, and it's helpful for business collaboration, I think. We're constantly looking for new ways to collaborate, and I think this helps narrow it down.
On this track, do you believe TIAs can be conducted jointly with other nation states?
That's a great question. I think on the one hand, it is super useful, especially when collaborating with more developing economies, partners that are developing economies, because then the resources come in to actually assess certain technologies. Not only that, the political will also comes in, right? Possibly when it becomes, say, a strategic issue. Um, Going back to what I said earlier, the great challenge about TIA implementation in many parts of the world is that there's just not enough funding for it and not enough
Yes.
interest,
Yes.
right? Um, it, and when there is that initiative coming in from elsewhere, sometimes that is super useful. So yeah, I think definitely.
And how might that happen in practice? Does each nation state identify a group of consultants, or is there an agency within its sort of institution set? Do they do it at the same time, or they do it independently, then share their results? what are some of your thoughts around that?
I think this depends on the political culture of the country you're working with, right? In some cases, it might be better to hire consultants or experts, independent experts, who can probably conduct those analysis without much government interference. And it could be a joint effort, say, between universities or between industries or consultancies conducting that analysis with funding from, say, Australia and the partner country. Or alternatively, I mean, it could be funding from, say, Australia and consultants from the other country. Um, One thing that's fundamental, though, is that any kind of framework drawn up must be kept, and there must be effort to ensure continuity. Because again, the great challenge is that oftentimes this gets repeated, right? The same kinds of works end up getting repeated, and sometimes the analysis gets shelved. So, I guess the one thing I'll add there is that even it doesn't matter how it works in practice. I think if at the end of the day the research gets set aside and TIA is not prioritized as an issue, as an area of collaboration, then I mean, it just goes the way of any kind of other TIA, which is maybe we'll adopt them, maybe we won't.
Yeah, we've seen that, and some of our interviewees have actually said they've been totally shelved in terms of the results,
Yeah.
and not only just made unavailable, but really there's no trace that they actually even occurred.
And I think in that sense, transparency also matters a great deal. I mean, um, perhaps one of the reasons why there isn't much of an interest, political interest in TIAs is because I mean, the term TIA itself is relatively foreign to most people, right? Outside of
Yes.
the field. I think no one really, I mean, people only consider an issue when they either face it themselves, again, when the social or environmental economic repercussions are quite evident,
Hmm.
or you know, they might care about it when if something bad really happens. So that constant communication of the importance of TIA really matters. So this includes, for example, I think incorporating into perhaps even joint statements between leaders, right? Making it an agency priority when say, I don't know, the equivalents of, say, the industry department here in Australia and, say, in India work together on the subject.
Yes.
So it has to be continuously a political commitment. And I remember, you know, we do a lot of capacity building work, and it's on subjects that sometimes will never really be a priority or not be a priority today or tomorrow or maybe next week. It might be a priority 10 years from now. But I remember like one official from Southeast Asia mentioning to me, if you want to make sure that a subject remains a priority, you got to make sure that it's in the joint statements, because otherwise, so that way officials and diplomats will read it and they'll make sure to get it done. If it's not there and it's not continuously there, then that's just forgotten.
Yeah, a big message to all those listening, and the importance of that continuity throughout a technology's life cycle. You know, as
Yeah,
you said, it's a continuous process. You know, it may not happen
yeah.
every week or every 6 months, but it has to be logged and reflected on. And it doesn't mean we don't change our ideas as they emerge, and different challenges may come up, or different benefits may become very apparent to a market. But yes, this continuous focus is really important. Any shortcomings of TIA or limitations or its misuse?
Um, I mean, I'm not entirely sure if I mean, I'm sure there are examples out there where TIAs fall completely through. Maybe it could be in the form of example, in the example that there are clear enough guidelines, or perhaps even too many people in the process itself, right? That it just becomes overly complex. But I guess the great challenge with TIAs again just comes down to making it live beyond just the period of analysis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. Um, Stakeholders. Now, you've mentioned quite a few so far. Would you be able to summarize who the key stakeholders are in a technology impact assessment?
I think first and foremost, it is a government as the key regulator, key agent. You know, government regulates, and they're the ones with the authority and the power to enforce laws, right? So any government agency must be actively involved in the TIA, not in the assessment, but in the defense of it and the protection of it. Um, Industry, of course, matters a great deal as well, given that they're the producers and the ones designing the equipment. But of course, I think academia and civil society matters a great deal as well. Ideally, it is the academics and the experts in society and beyond that can provide that fairly honest assessment of technology's impact on a wider scale. I think, and they will come up with the assessment that industry will have to listen to, but then it's government that has to protect all of them and making sure that that process exists and there will be continuation. So perhaps those three, very broad.
Yes, very good. We have looked for broad categories, and
Of it.
this is very relevant. Some have also mentioned other entities like the media and the special role they play in supporting the outcomes of a TIA potentially. But
Yeah.
yes, you,
It's always the challenge though, getting the media interested in TIA outcomes.
yes, it's because it's not immediate. Back to that
No,
key thing that you were talking about. I remember speaking to one of the most senior people in the media coming to do training
yeah,
at one of the universities here in Australia, and he basically gave me a fundamental principle, which is if it's not the cost of bread or the price of milk, most people don't care. It's not,
yes,
you know, it's not a very instantaneous thing, especially with long-term planning, should we
yes,
do this or leave it to somebody else in 10 years' time? But that's the general sentiment with people who are really busy and increasingly receiving a lot of messaging from
that's right.
diverse media.
That's right. Yeah, I'll add them to the list anyway. I think it's
Yeah,
super important people to engage with.
yes. Now, we've come to the end of the interview. Thank you for being so succinct in your responses. I wanted to ask you if there's anything else you wanted to add about this whole area that we haven't spoken about, or anything that you wanted to elaborate on further.
Not at all. I think again, the success of a TIA depends on political will. So that has to be completely, underlined over and over again.
I will take that away as a huge point coming out of all the interviews. I'm hearing you loud and clear, and I think that's really, really important. It's something as well that people have mentioned, but in passing, not as just firmly as you. But thank you for reminding us of this. I think you're
Yeah.
right, and I look forward to sharing the outcomes of all the videos with you and our listeners.
Thank you so much, Bettina, for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Gatra. Bye bye now.